The English Channel, September 26, 1940. The Battle of Britain rages in the skies above southern England, as Hurricane and Spitfire pilots duel with Messerschmitt fighters over the smoke-filled cities below. By this late stage of the battle, fighter command has been pushed to its absolute limits. In the past month alone, 295 RAF fighters have been lost, with another 171 severely damaged. The casualty toll is staggering. 103 pilots killed and 128 wounded, many of them irreplaceable veterans whose loss weakens every surviving squadron. But on this particular afternoon, something far stranger is about to unfold over the choppy waters near the Isle of Wight. Royal Air Force pilot officer D.H. Clark peers through the scratched canopy of his aircraft, scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing Hurricane pilot, reportedly shot down earlier that morning. The September sun glints off the waves as Clark maintains his patrol altitude of barely 100 feet above the water, low enough to spot debris or a yellow life jacket against the dark sea. Behind him, Sergeant Hunt mans the hydraulically powered turret, its 4 Browning machine guns trained skyward, ready for action. The turret mechanism hums quietly as Hunt periodically traverses the system, checking its response to his controls. The electrical firing circuits are armed, with 600 rounds per gun ready to deliver devastating firepower at Hunt's command. Their aircraft is no sleek Spitfire or rugged Hurricane, but rather the ungainly Blackburn Rock, a turret fighter that most pilots have already written off as a failure. At just 223 miles per hour maximum speed, the Rock is slower than virtually every other fighter in the sky. Even the lumbering Bolton-Paul Defiant, another failed turret fighter, can manage 230 miles per hour in level flight. The Rock's bizarre design, with no forward-firing guns and all armament concentrated in a rotating turret behind the pilot, represents one of the most unusual approaches to aerial warfare ever attempted. Yet, on this September afternoon, Clark and Hunt are about to prove that even the most unlikely aircraft can deliver the most extraordinary results. The concept of search and rescue missions has become increasingly critical as the Battle of Britain intensifies. With dozens of aircraft being shot down daily over the Channel, both sides have recognized the vital importance of recovering experienced pilots whose training represents months of irreplaceable preparation. The Germans have established their Seenotdienst, a comprehensive air-sea rescue service operating white-painted Heinkel HE-59 seaplanes, marked with prominent red crosses to indicate their non-combatant status. As Clark and Hunt patrol at low altitude, Hunt suddenly calls out through the intercom. There, skimming just above the wavetops, is what appears to be a large aircraft heading directly toward them. Clark initially assumes it must be a friendly ferry Swordfish returning from a reconnaissance mission. The twin floats and biplane configuration match perfectly, and at this distance the aircraft's markings are unclear. But as the range closes to less than a mile, both men realize their mistake with a jolt of adrenaline. The approaching aircraft bears the distinctive black crosses of the Luftwaffe. What they have encountered is a Heinkel HE-59 seaplane, one of Germany's primary air-sea rescue aircraft. Originally designed as a torpedo bomber and reconnaissance platform in the early 1930s, the HE-59 had been converted to rescue duties as the war progressed. Painted white with prominent red crosses to indicate its non-combatant status, the German machine is likely searching for survivors from earlier air battles. Its crew of 4 includes a pilot, navigator, radio operator, and medical orderly, all trained in the complex procedures of water rescue operations. At a maximum speed of just 137 miles per hour, the lumbering seaplane presents an almost stationary target for the approaching Rock. However, Clark faces an immediate moral and tactical dilemma. International law clearly prohibits attacks on medical aircraft, but British Fighter Command has grown increasingly suspicious of German rescue operations. Intelligence reports suggest that many HE-59 flights serve a dual purpose, combining rescue missions with valuable reconnaissance gathering. Or the stage is set for one of the most bizarre dogfights of the entire war, a 25-minute aerial duel between 2 of the slowest military aircraft operating over Europe. Neither machine was designed for air-to-air combat, yet both crews are about to find themselves locked in a deadly contest of speed, maneuverability, and firepower that will test the limits of their ungainly aircraft and challenge every assumption about aerial warfare. To understand how such an unlikely encounter came to pass, we must first examine the curious history of the Blackburn Rock and the failed philosophy that brought it into existence. The concept of the turret fighter emerged in the 1930s as aircraft designers grappled with the challenge of creating effective bomber interceptors. Traditional fighters armed with forward-firing guns required pilots to execute complex deflection shooting, calculating the precise point in space where their bullets would intersect with a maneuvering enemy aircraft. This technique, known as deflection shooting, demanded split-second calculations involving the target's speed, direction, distance, and rate of closure. Pilots had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and the ballistic characteristics of their ammunition, while simultaneously maneuvering their own aircraft and avoiding enemy fire. The complexity of these calculations meant that even experienced pilots often missed their targets entirely, wasting precious ammunition and fuel in futile attacks. The turret fighter promised to eliminate this problem entirely through a technique known as no-allowance shooting. By positioning the aircraft beneath and slightly behind an enemy bomber, a gunner could fire directly at the target without needing to calculate lead angles or bullet drop. The gunner simply kept his sights on the enemy aircraft and pulled the trigger, while gravity and the forward motion of the fighter combined to send bullets along what appeared to be a perfectly straight trajectory. In theory, this approach offered several compelling advantages. The turret gunner could engage targets from multiple angles without requiring the pilot to maneuver the entire aircraft into a specific attack position. A formation of turret fighters could theoretically devastate bomber formations by approaching from below and behind, where most enemy aircraft had limited defensive armament. The concentrated firepower of 4 machine guns, all aimed by a dedicated gunner, promised to deliver far more effective fire than single-seat fighters with fixed forward-firing weapons. Still, the British Air Ministry, convinced of this logic, issued Specification O.30/35, calling for a 2-seat turret fighter capable of operating from aircraft carriers. This requirement reflected the Royal Navy's unique needs for fleet defense, where carrier-based fighters would need to intercept enemy bombers attacking naval formations far from friendly airfields. The specification demanded an aircraft capable of matching contemporary bomber performance while delivering superior firepower through its rotating turret system. Blackburn Aircraft, already developing the Skua dive bomber for the Fleet Air Arm, proposed a derivative design that would share the same basic airframe and Bristol Perseus radial engine while incorporating a power-operated gun turret in place of the rear cockpit. This approach promised significant cost savings and reduced development time, as many components could be shared between the two aircraft types. The company's proposal also included provisions for dive bombing capability, making the Rock a multi-role aircraft that could serve both fighter and attack missions. The Fraser-Nash VN5 turret selected for the Rock represented the cutting edge of aircraft armament technology. Electrically controlled and hydraulically powered by a system operating at 285 pounds per square inch pressure, it could rotate through 360 degrees and elevate its 4 303-inch Browning machine guns to 85 degrees above horizontal. The system could traverse fast enough to track any contemporary aircraft and deliver a concentrated burst of fire that, in theory, could destroy any bomber in seconds. The turret's sophisticated fire control system included automatic interruption mechanisms to prevent the guns from firing when they would hit the aircraft's own propeller or tail surfaces. The gunner operated the system through a single control column that could move the entire turret assembly while maintaining perfect sight alignment. Each of the 4 Browning guns carried 600 rounds of ammunition, providing enough firepower for sustained combat without the need for frequent reloading. However, the Rock's problems became apparent almost immediately during flight testing. The protruding turret created significant drag, reducing the aircraft's maximum speed to just 223 miles per hour. Slower even than the Skua dive bomber, from which it was derived. The additional weight of the turret and its complex hydraulic systems further compromised performance, leaving the Rock unable to catch most enemy bombers, let alone engage hostile fighters, on anything approaching equal terms. The Bristol Perseus, twin engine, while reliable and well-proven, simply could not provide enough power to overcome the aerodynamic penalties imposed by the turret installation. Producing 830 horsepower for takeoff and 905 horsepower at altitude, the Perseus represented excellent technology for its era. However, the Rock's loaded weight of nearly 8,000 pounds meant that the aircraft's power-to-weight ratio was insufficient for effective fighter operations. When the first production Rocks reached 706 Naval Air Squadron in April 1939, pilots quickly discovered that their new mounts were virtually useless in their intended role. Squadron leader Dick Law, commanding officer of 706 Squadron, reported that the Rock was slower than most of our potential targets and incapable of catching anything except perhaps a flying boat. His assessment proved prophetic when the squadron deployed to HMS Glorious for operations off Norway. During the Norwegian campaign of April and May 1940, rocks proved completely unable to intercept German reconnaissance aircraft or effectively engage enemy fighters. Squadron commanders reported that the aircraft were so slow they actually hindered operations by requiring fighter escorts that could have been better employed elsewhere. The Rock's performance was so disappointing that several squadrons requested immediate re-equipment with conventional fighters, despite the training time that such a transition would require. The one bright spot in the Rock's dismal operational record came at Dunkirk, where Naval Air Squadron 804's midshipman G.R. Day managed to shoot down a Junkers Ju-88 medium bomber. This victory, achieved when Day's gunner caught the German aircraft in a vulnerable position during a diving attack, represented the type's only confirmed air-to-air success during frontline operations. However, even this achievement came at considerable cost, as the slow-flying Rock barely escaped destruction at the hands of escorting Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. By the summer of 1940, most Rocks had been withdrawn from frontline service and relegated to training duties or anti-aircraft cooperation work. It was in this latter role that Clark and Hunt found themselves patrolling the waters off the Isle of Wight on September 26. Their ungainly fighter pressed into service as a search and rescue aircraft. The Heinkel H-59 they encountered represented an equally curious chapter in aviation history. Originally designed by Ernst Heinkel's company as a torpedo bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, the HE-59 had first flown in 1931. Its unusual twin-float configuration and fabric-covered biplane wings gave it excellent water-handling characteristics but limited performance in the air. With a maximum speed of just 137 miles per hour, it was among the slowest aircraft still in military service by 1940. However, what the HE-59 lacked in speed, it made up for in versatility and reliability. Its spacious fuselage could accommodate stretchers for wounded personnel, survival equipment, and medical supplies. The aircraft's ability to land on water made it invaluable for rescuing aircrew who had ditched in the sea, while its long range of over 700 miles allowed it to operate far from shore bases. German rescue crews praised the type's stability and predictable handling characteristics, essential qualities for operations in rough weather conditions. The conversion of HE-59 aircraft to air-sea rescue duties early in the war reflected Germany's recognition of the importance of pilot recovery. The Luftwaffe had calculated that training a replacement pilot cost approximately the same as building a new fighter aircraft, making pilot rescue operations economically as well as humanely justified. The distinctive white paint scheme and red cross markings were adopted to provide protection under international law, which theoretically prohibited attacks on medical aircraft and personnel. However, British intelligence had long suspected that German air-sea rescue operations served a dual purpose. While rescuing downed airmen was certainly a humanitarian mission, these flights also provided valuable reconnaissance opportunities, allowing German crews to observe British shipping movements, defensive positions, and weather conditions. The slow, low-flying aircraft could loiter for hours over specific areas, gathering intelligence that would be invaluable for future bombing raids. As Clark closed the distance to the HE-59, he faced a decision that would define the rest of the engagement. International law clearly prohibited attacks on medical aircraft, but British Fighter Command had issued increasingly ambiguous guidance about German rescue operations. Just weeks earlier, RAF intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting that some HE-59 flights were indeed conducting reconnaissance missions under the cover of rescue operations. The German crew, spotting the approaching Rock, initially showed no signs of alarm. The white paint and red cross markings clearly identified their aircraft as a non-combatant, and they likely assumed the British fighter would simply escort them away from the operational area. However, as Clark maneuvered closer to inspect the HE-59's activities, the situation began to escalate with the deadly inevitability of two trains approaching on the same track. What happened next remains a matter of some historical debate. According to British records, the German aircraft suddenly opened fire on the Rock, forcing Clark to respond in self-defense. German accounts, where they exist, suggest that Clark fired first, violating international conventions governing the treatment of medical aircraft. What is certain is that both aircraft were soon exchanging fire in one of the strangest dogfights of the entire war. The HE-59, designed for coastal reconnaissance and rescue work, was armed with a single 7.9mm machine gun and a flexible mount operated by the observer. Against the Rock's 4 fixed Browning guns, this represented a significant disadvantage in firepower. However, the German crew had one crucial advantage: Their aircraft was designed to operate at extremely low altitudes over water, while the Rock was optimized for medium-altitude interception work. As the engagement began, both aircraft were flying at less than 50 feet above the choppy waters of the English Channel. At this altitude, the Rock's advantages in speed and climb rate were largely negated, while the HE-59's superior low-speed handling characteristics came into play. The German pilot proved remarkably skilled at using his aircraft's slow-flying capabilities to avoid Hunt's gunfire, while maneuvering to give his observer clear shots at the British fighter. For 25 minutes, the two ungainly aircraft circled and maneuvered just above the wavetops in a deadly ballet. Clark repeatedly attempted to bring his aircraft into position for Hunt to deliver a killing burst, but the HE-59 pilot's intimate knowledge of his aircraft's capabilities allowed him to evade each attack. The German crew's experience in low-altitude operations became increasingly apparent as they used every advantage their aircraft possessed. The HE-59's biplane configuration provided superior maneuverability at low speeds, allowing it to execute tight turns that the Rock simply could not match. Its twin floats acted as additional lifting surfaces at low speeds, giving the aircraft remarkable stability, even in sharp turns. The German pilot exploited these characteristics expertly, keeping his aircraft in a constant state of gentle maneuvering that made accurate gunnery almost impossible. Meanwhile, the German observer scored several hits on the Rock's wings and fuselage, though none proved immediately disabling. The British aircraft's robust construction, inherited from its Skua predecessor, absorbed the 7.9mm rounds without critical damage. However, Clark and Hunt could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to their cockpit, a reminder of how vulnerable they remained despite their superior firepower. The turning point came when Clark, growing frustrated with his inability to gain a decisive advantage, decided to exploit the one area where his aircraft clearly outperformed its opponent: power and structural strength. The Bristol Perseus engine, while insufficient for high-altitude interception work, could still provide significant performance advantages at sea level, where its supercharger was most effective. Pushing the Perseus to full power, Clark climbed above the HE-59 and then dove down in a high-speed attack that the German pilot simply could not match. The Rock's speed advantage, minimal in level flight, became decisive in a diving attack where the aircraft could exceed 250 miles per hour. The HE-59, limited by its biplane structure and float configuration, could not hope to maintain such speeds without risking structural failure. Hunt, finally presented with a clear shot from an advantageous angle, opened fire with all 4 Browning guns. The concentrated burst, representing nearly 3,000 rounds per minute of firepower, tore through the HE-59's fabric-covered wings and punctured its fuel tanks. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within seconds, the German aircraft was losing altitude and streaming fuel, its crews struggling to maintain control as their crippled machine settled toward the water. The HE-59 struck the surface of the English Channel at approximately 4:25 in the afternoon, its crew likely killed on impact. The aircraft's fabric construction and twin float configuration meant that it broke up almost immediately upon hitting the water, leaving only scattered debris floating on the waves. Clark and Hunt circled the crash site briefly, searching for survivors, but found no sign of life among the wreckage. As Clark began his flight back to base, Hunt made a disturbing discovery while inspecting their aircraft for battle damage. 2 German incendiary bullets had penetrated the Rock's main fuel tank, but had miraculously failed to ignite. The bullets remained lodged in the tank walls, their incendiary charges intact and potentially deadly. Any spark or sudden impact could trigger an explosion that would destroy the aircraft and kill both crew members instantly. The successful engagement between Clark's Rock and the German HE-59 represented a unique moment in aviation history. Here were 2 aircraft, neither designed for air-to-air combat, engaging in a prolonged dogfight that tested the limits of both machines and their crews. The Rock, despite its many shortcomings as a fighter aircraft, had proven capable of destroying an enemy aircraft in actual combat conditions. However, the victory did little to change official opinion about the Rock's capabilities as a frontline fighter. By late 1940, most aviation experts recognized that the turret fighter concept was fundamentally flawed when applied to high-performance interceptor aircraft. The drag penalty imposed by rotating turrets made it impossible for such aircraft to achieve the speeds necessary to engage modern enemy fighters effectively. The Rock's brief moment of glory over the English Channel thus represented both the vindication and the swan song of the turret fighter concept. While Clark and Hunt had proven that the aircraft could be effective under specific circumstances, those circumstances were so narrow and unusual that they hardly justified the continued production of such specialized machines. By 1941, most rocks had been withdrawn from operational service and assigned to training duties or scrapped entirely. The few that remained in service were employed primarily in secondary roles such as target towing and air-sea rescue work, far from the frontline fighter duties for which they had been originally intended. Clark and Hunt's victory over the HE-59 remains unique in aviation history as the only confirmed air-to-air victory achieved by a Blackburn rock in single combat. Their 25-minute dogfight over the English Channel demonstrated that even the most maligned aircraft could prove effective under the right circumstances, while also illustrating the complex challenges facing aircraft designers during one of the most revolutionary periods in aviation history. The final Blackburn rock was retired from Royal Navy service in June 1943, ending one of the most unusual chapters in British aviation history. Of the 136 aircraft built, none survive today, though detailed records preserve the memory of this remarkable experiment in fighter design.